Thank you, Emma, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be back here again in Cardiff, and it's great that we have such lovely weather compared to last year. There's such a broad number of issues that I could have covered in relation to social considerations, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm just going to focus on one, and it's using public procurement to promote job creation and to combat unemployment. This has been a very topical theme in the last few years, particularly with the economic downturn and the current unemployment rates throughout the EU. Although they are improving. Just to put some highlights there, I do notice that Wales at the moment is actually doing better than the UK marginally in terms of unemployment rates, 7.1 compared to 7.2 in the UK. But Ireland is there at 12%, and of course we've got Greece and Spain with very high unemployment rates. So I'm constantly being asked by central government departments, by contracting authorities, what can we do in our procurement processes to create jobs, particularly for the local community? Can we do it? What's the scope? So we're going to look at a few of these questions now in the next 15 minutes. It's clear that creation of employment, the combating unemployment is a key objective of the EU. There's many examples of it throughout the treaty. I've just put a couple of the examples there. I'm just going to fly through some of these slides because we are short on time. Even in procurement policy, we know that incorporating social considerations is a theme that the European Commission has been looking at, and indeed it was one of the key themes when the new directives eventually became before the European Parliament. I understand that the vast majority of the amendments that were proposed by the Parliament did relate to social issues. In the Green Paper, at the very outset of the new directives, there was talk about using social policy in the procurement directives to influence behaviour of economic operators, and we have of course the European Commission's interpretive communication on integrating social considerations into public procurement. So the debate, I think, as to whether or not we should be using procurement to drive social agendas, I think that debate is more or less over. It is clear that we can use procurement to influence social agendas, and indeed it is something now which is going to feature quite strongly in the new directives. Looking at the current state of play and the current directive, the focus really in the current directives in terms of incorporating social considerations has been through contract conditions. So there's been a huge debate as to whether or not you can actually evaluate, for example, how many jobs is the tenderer going to create in the performance of the contract. What is their corporate agenda in terms of creating jobs and so on. So there's been a lot written as to whether or not those types of criteria can be taken into account. It's clear from the directive that really when these directives were drafted, that the Commission was focusing on incorporating social considerations through contract conditions. So we have recital 33, which talks about, in particular, in relation to employment of people experiencing particular difficulty in achieving integration and so on, that you can use contract performance conditions to bring those factors into play. And then in the operative part of the directive, you have Article 26, which says that contracting authorities can lay down conditions and they can relate to social and environmental considerations. Now, the important point, I think, about this article is you'll see that there's no mention of a link to the subject matter of the contract. So this whole debate as to whether or not creating jobs, job employment, social considerations, whether or not it has to have a link to the subject matter of the contract, doesn't arise under the current directives because it's not in there in Article 26. So it has been much easier to incorporate social considerations into contracts. So an example of a contract condition you might see, for example, the contractor agrees to secure the creation of X number of jobs throughout in the performance of the contract. And you see, for example, percentage of the workforce has to be employed from current long-term unemployed and so on. So you often see examples of these contract conditions in current contracts. But I'd ask a question as to whether or not this is the right place to be incorporating social considerations, because really there's a bit of a balance to be made in terms of incorporating those types of clauses. For example, if you're an SME, there might be quite a cost to you involved in having to comply with a contract condition like that, going out and recruiting a number of unemployed, creating internships and trainee programs. But if it's in the contract, you have to do it. It's almost a mandatory condition. And often there is no scope for negotiation on those contract conditions. There is the cost for the contracting authority itself may increase because perhaps the performance of the contract now isn't as efficient as it might have been if there hadn't been this requirement for the recruitment of X number of long-term unemployed and so on. In terms of enforcement, how do you enforce these contract conditions? There's always going to be a level of enforcement, but the contracting authority is going to go because it's a condition that tenders had to sign up to, and that if there is a material change to that condition, there could be an issue from a procurement perspective, and we know all about the Precetex case. So there's an enforcement issue around the contract condition, and also it may also have an impact on the current workforce. Persons who may have been recruited, say, in the last year or 2 years, they might be pushed out because the contractor has to go out now and recruit these long-term unemployed to comply with this contract condition. So perhaps including these types of considerations into the contract is not the best place. So then we turn to the criteria and whether or not we can actually evaluate. So wouldn't it be better for the tenderer to propose how it's actually going to incorporate social considerations or provisions in relation to unemployed in its performance of the contract? Can't we just evaluate that? So on that, we have the current recital, the very first recital in the Public Sector Directive, which does recognise that award criteria, can be in the social area. So we have a reference to social here in relation to award criteria. But then you have to meet the four criteria in terms of the criteria. A, they have to be linked to the subject matter of the contract. B, the criteria can't confer unrestricted freedom of choice on the contracting authority. They have to be expressly mentioned, and they must comply with the fundamental principles of EU law. So here we have the possibility in the recital to incorporate social criteria, but you have to meet all of these four conditions. And so you would think, well, then why can't we see these types of criteria in our tender documents? For example, our pre-qual stage, can't we just evaluate the candidate's corporate responsibility in relation to combating unemployment? If I'm the Department of Jobs and Innovation in Ireland, I might be very interested as to whether or not a proposed contractor has got a social responsibility programme in terms of recruiting in long-term unemployed or providing internships or traineeships to persons. In terms of the award criteria then, I might want to evaluate the percentage of the tender's workforce which will comprise persons recruited from the live register. I might also want to evaluate the number of interns that are going to be proposed for this job. So these are all social considerations. These are things that I might want to evaluate. But then the question is, are these lawful criteria? Can we do it? Okay, in relation to pre-qual, two key cases I would mention. The first is the Beanstays case, and here there was a condition in the tender competition that the contractor had to employ long-term unemployed persons, and the court said that this has no relation to checking the contractor's suitability on the basis of economic and financial standing or their technical knowledge and ability. So therefore, it was not a valid pre-qual criteria, wasn't a lawful pre-qual criteria. And again, in the Commission versus Netherlands case, the fair trade case, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, the court said that the Article 48, which sets out the rules in the Public Sector Directive for pre-qualification, that is an exhaustive list. It's an exhaustive list of the factors that can be taken into account, and criteria of sustainable purchasing and socially responsible business is not connected to any of these factors. So I think we have a clear statement here that it'll be very difficult to build in to your pre-qualification evaluation issues relating to social responsibility. In relation to the award criteria, we know that they have to be linked to the subject matter of the contract, and that has been the key issue in terms of whether or not we can include social criteria in the award criteria. The Helsinki bus case, the Weinstrom case, we know that these cases clearly state that you have to have a clear link to the subject matter of the contract, and it has to be specific and objective. That's what they said in the Helsinki bus case, specific and objective. And then, so there was a bit of a debate then, how far we can go. Can we put in, for example, conditions relating to how many of your workforce is going to be recruited from the live register? Can we bring this into the evaluation? And I have to say, most lawyers have shied away from that answer, and I think, have probably felt that it would be that there could be issues in terms of the subject matter of the contract. The Commission tried to help by giving a bit of guidance in relation to the NordPay case, which I think is not a hugely helpful case. In that case, this question was asked about whether or not you could include a criteria in relation to combating unemployment, and the court, it would appear from the court that they said that you can have it as a secondary or an additional criterion, but not as a main award criterion, because it's not linked to the subject matter of the contract. So you could put in a tie-break situation where you have two bidders the exact same, then you could apply this type of criterion. But again, very hard, very rare would you have a situation where you have a tie-break where you'd want to put this particular additional criterion in. So then we come to the fair trade case. And we now have a smile on our face because this gave some clarity in terms of social criteria and the ability to incorporate them into the award criteria. Here, the Dutch Contracting Authority had inserted an award criterion relating to the use of two particular labels, and the label that particularly focused on is the Max Havelaar label, which related to that the products, the coffee that was going to be supplied in relation to the coffee machines that they were procuring had to have been of a fair trade origin. So you're looking at coffee here that is going to be supplied, and you're looking at maybe stage 3 stages back in the process, how that coffee was produced. Was it produced in a socially responsible manner under fair trade conditions? So not linked to the actual supply of the coffee, but something back in the process. First of all, the court confirmed that contracting authority can use social criteria in the evaluation. The criteria here related to the social and environmental characteristics, which fall within the Article 53, which is the award criteria provision in the directives. That the criteria related to products, the supply of which constituted part of the subject matter of the contract. So this particular criteria related to products which were going to be supplied as part of the contract, and that there was no necessity to have an intrinsic link, to link the criterion to the intrinsic characteristic of the product. So the court decided that this was a permissible award criterion. Now I have to say I do struggle with this judgment because it seems to me slightly artificial in terms of the link to the subject matter of the contract. As I said, you're looking a few stages back at at the product in terms of how it was basically procured in a socially responsible manner, and I do feel that it is a bit of a stretch in terms of saying that it is linked to the subject matter of the contract, but nevertheless that was the decision of the court, and I would say that that's where the new dawn started in terms of social criteria back in the fair trade case. So moving on to the new directives and how now this theme has been taken on board. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to flick over workshops, reserves, contracts. They have all been expanded, and now before we had this concept of sheltered workshops, which related purely to disabled persons. Now the concept of sheltered workshops or reserved contracts has been extended to include disadvantaged, such as unemployed persons. So that's just something to note. Pre-qual criteria, again, just reiterating the point that very difficult to include any criteria in relation to social aspects, social responsibility of the contractor. And here in recital 97, the court is the new directives are saying contracting authorities should hence not be allowed to require tenders to have a certain corporate, social, or environmental responsibility policy in place. So incorporating social criteria into your pre-qual, I think, is going to be very difficult. Award criteria. Now, here, and something I should say about the recitals, there's 134 recitals in this new public sector directive compared with, I think, was 51 in the last directive. So there's a huge amount in the recitals. So, and it's a little bit unfortunate because, you know, the recitals are only, you know, for interpretation and clarifying, so they're not the operative part of the directives, but you'll find a lot of hidden gems in the recitals, so they are worth reading. But in relation to award criteria, the recital is saying, with a view to better integration of social considerations, contracting authorities should be allowed to use award criteria or contract performance conditions relating to the work, supplies or services. Now, this is the important part. Under the public contract, in any respect and at any stage of their life cycles, any respect or any stage of their life cycles, and then skipping down, even where such factors do not form part of the material substance. Material substance basically is the point about intrinsic characteristic in fair trade. So we've got a very broad now interpretation of award criteria and social criteria. You can use these criteria provided that they relate in any respect to any stage of the life cycle of the work, supplies or services. So it's a very broad interpretation of subject matter, I have to say. The new recital 99, just in case there was any doubt, goes on to say that measures aimed at favouring social integration, disadvantaged persons, so on, can also be the subject matter of award criteria or contract performance conditions, provided they relate to the work, supplies, services provided under the contract. Now, the point about this, I think, is that there's no doubt as to whether or not we can use social criteria at the award stage. The clear point is now that we can. You've got the optional part in Article 67, and again, it's just a reiteration of that very broad interpretation of what are the criteria that can be included. Of course, we still do have the constraints. The criteria have to be objective, transparent, non-discriminatory, can't confer unrestricted freedom of choice, shall ensure the possibility of effective competition, and shall be capable of being verified. So you still have to meet those conditions. Now, one final point about contract conditions, which we started with at the outset. As I said, the push in the current public sector directives was to include these these types of social considerations in the contract. But now we have actually a narrowing of that, I would say, because we now have the requirement that the special condition, any conditions in the contract must be linked to the subject matter of the contract. So previously we didn't have mention of subject matter of the contract, but now we have it in Article 70, and that's a bit of an interesting departure, I would say, because previously we didn't have that requirement. So there seems to be a broadening in relation to the ability to bring social criteria into the award stage, and possibly a narrowing of the ability at the contract stage. So, lost opportunity or new dawn, I would definitely say that there is greater scope now for incorporating social criteria, but difficulty, I think, at pre-qualification stage, and I think that's clear from the case law and from the directives. As I said, enforcement, contracting authorities have to be mindful of these provisions if they've evaluated them, and one particular tender has achieved more points than another, and this has been the reason why they've won, and now you allow them to not recruit the 6 or 7 employees, long-term unemployed, that they said they were going to. That could be a material change, so you just need to be careful on that. Already we're seeing contracting authorities across Europe already latching on to these provisions in the new directives, and there's a number of examples, and I did have them in earlier version slides, but a number of examples of employment initiatives now being used as a result of what's coming down the line. One final point of mention is local labour clauses. There's a lot of, I think this is an area where there's a big divergence between law and practice, and we see lots and lots and lots of examples of contracts with local labour clauses, there's of course you've got the requirement that non-discrimination, free movement of services, workers, establishments, and so on. So there's a bit of a conflict there, and I think maybe that this is an area that needs needs a bit more discussion, and maybe perhaps that might be the discussion for next year. So thank you very much.